They said the devil walked among them, that witches whispered curses in the night. But what if the real evil wasn't in the shadows, but sitting in the courtroom? Watch the boring story they never told you, one that ended in silence, blood, and 20 innocent deaths. Full story now on Whisper from History.
Snow clung to the bare branches of the Massachusetts wilderness in the dead of winter. 1692. Beneath the frozen crust of the New England soil, something dark began to stir, not in the earth, but in the hearts of men and women bound by fear, faith, and a deep mistrust of the unknown. In the isolated Puritan village of Salem, a spark of hysteria ignited a fire that would consume 19 innocent lives and leave a stain on American history that no frost could ever bury. It began in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. A rigid, controlling figure, Parris had brought his family to Salem Village 3 years earlier, hoping to escape debts and scandals in Boston. But even here, in this pious enclave, whispers followed him. His stern sermons were filled with warnings of the devil lurking among them, and his demands for more power and payment fueled resentment. Still, the community tolerated him for a while. Inside the parsonage, 2 young girls, his 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, suddenly fell ill. They twisted on the floor, shrieked uncontrollably, and claimed unseen hands were pricking their skin. They contorted in ways no child should, and nothing soothed them. The village doctor, William Griggs, gave a chilling diagnosis: not illness, but bewilderment. In an era where scripture reigned supreme, this wasn't merely a superstition, it was spiritual warfare. The devil, they believed, walked among them, and he had claimed the children of Salem as his battlefield. Within days, the household's slave Tituba found herself at the center of suspicion. An enslaved woman of Arawak and African descent, Tituba had told the girls stories, tales from her own culture, rich with spirits, omens, and dreams. Now those same stories were weaponized against her. Under pressure, she confessed not just to witchcraft, but to a horrifying conspiracy. She claimed there were others, witches living in Salem. That confession broke something open in the community. Fear, already threaded through the tight weave of their daily lives, began to unravel into mass panic. The Puritan world was a fragile ecosystem, rigid rules, constant surveillance, harsh punishments. Now, the invisible became visible. The devil wasn't just tempting from afar. He was here, in their homes, behind the faces they trusted. The afflicted girls began naming names. Sarah Gooda, homeless beggar, known for muttering curses under her breath. Sarah Osborne, a scandalous older woman who had defied church expectations by remarrying her servant. Easy targets. But once those arrests were made, the accusations didn't stop. They spread like infection. What had begun in a single household was now infecting an entire village. Friend turned against friend. Families split. Those who spoke out risked accusation. Those who remained silent invited suspicion. The social order that the Puritans had clung to so tightly was beginning to rot from the inside. And all the while, the cries of children, the pounding of fists on cell walls, the clatter of chains, and the hollow prayers of the condemned filled the cold New England air. But this was only the beginning. The devil's work, they believed, had just begun. And Salem, a village built on piety, was about to become a place of blood.
The jails of Essex County groaned under the weight of the accused. Cold, damp, and infested, these holding cells became temporary tombs for dozens, many of whom would never see freedom again. Sarah Good, pregnant and defiant, spat at her accusers. Sarah Osborne, already ill, wasted away in her cell. Tituba, once so feared, was now largely forgotten. Her confession sparing her immediate death, but not her dignity. The machinery of accusation had begun turning, and it no longer needed proof, only names. By March, the arrests had climbed into the dozens. The judges in Salem struggled to contain the chaos. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin took the lead in examining the accused. Their questioning resembled less a search for truth and more a public shaming, a spectacle where the assumption of guilt hung in the air like smoke. They demanded confessions. They searched for witches' marks on the skin. They used spectral evidence, a legally dubious claim that the spirit or specter of the accused was tormenting victims even if the person was elsewhere. This kind of testimony would never have been accepted under English common law. But in Salem, it was enough to ruin a life. If the afflicted screamed during a hearing, claiming the accused was pinching them or sending out invisible spirits, the judges took it seriously. The court did not demand tangible proof, it demanded conformity. And if you protested your innocence too loudly, it only deepened suspicion. In early spring, one of the most shocking accusations emerged. Rebecca Nurse, an elderly woman of deep piety, a respected matriarch, and a devoted Christian, was charged with witchcraft. Her arrest sent a chill through Salem. If someone like Rebecca could be accused, no one was safe. 70 years old, hard of hearing, gentle in spirit, she did not fit the image of a witch. But she had been involved in a long-standing land dispute with the Putnam family, and that was reason enough. The Putnams, especially Anne Putnam Sr. and her daughter Anne Jr., became central players in the hysteria. Their claims carried weight in court, and their motivations were quietly political as much as spiritual. The Puritan world was small. Grudges, property, inheritance, these were fertile soil for accusation. April brought more arrests, and among them came an even darker turn, the accusation of Martha Corey. A church member, sharp-minded and skeptical, Martha had questioned the validity of the trials. That alone made her suspect. Her arrest shocked her husband, Giles Corey, a stubborn old farmer. He refused to stand down. His resistance would cost him dearly. The community watched, paralyzed by fear, as more of their neighbors were hauled off in carts, chained at the ankles. Some recanted their doubts and joined the accusers. Others tried to flee Salem entirely. But flight was suspicion, and suspicion was nearly as fatal as confession. In Boston, colonial governor Sir William Phips arrived with new authority, and with him came a new court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, tasked with handling the overwhelming number of cases. The man chosen to preside was Chief Justice William Stoughton, a deeply pious man with little patience for dissent and full faith in the existence of witchcraft. Under his hand, the trials would escalate from chaos to horror. No longer was this simply about punishment. It was about purification. The belief that the colony was under divine judgment pushed the judges to act swiftly and without mercy. And the first executions were drawing near. By June, the scaffold was built. The noose had been measured. And Salem, gripped by divine panic, prepared to offer blood in the name of salvation. The sun rose over Gallows Hill on June 10, 1692, casting long shadows over the small crowd gathered at the base of the slope. The first execution of the Salem Witch Trials was about to take place. Bridget Bishop, a 60-year-old woman known for her bright clothes, multiple marriages, and tendency to speak her mind, stood with a noose around her neck. She denied the charges, but her fate had already been sealed, not by evidence, but by fear and spectacle. Her execution marked a grim turning point. The court, convinced of its righteousness, now had blood on its hands, and no intention of stopping. In the following weeks, the rhythm of arrests, accusations, and executions intensified. Names were whispered behind closed doors. Neighbors watched each other warily. Ministers who had once preached unity now watched their congregations fracture under suspicion. The trials became public theater. Each confession added more names. Each denial deepened the court's resolve. For many, The only way to survive was to lie. George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village, was accused of leading the witches. He had enemies, both political and personal, and he had once borrowed money without repaying it, a moral failing interpreted as a spiritual one. Burroughs was brought in chains, accused of supernatural strength and consorting with the devil. He maintained his innocence. Even when sentenced to die, he spoke calmly and clearly. At the gallows, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something many believed no witch could do. The crowd hesitated. Murmurs spread. Was it possible they were about to hang a godly man? But Cotton Mather, a powerful minister from Boston, had arrived to observe. He quickly intervened, urging the crowd to remain faithful. The devil can sometimes transform himself into an angel of light, he warned. The execution proceeded. Burroughs swung from the rope. Among the hanged were Martha Carrier, accused by her own children under duress. John Proctor, a farmer who had spoken out against the court, now found himself crushed under its weight. His pregnant wife Elizabeth was spared, but only temporarily. Her life would be held until the child was born. Even children were not safe. 9-year-old Dorothy Good was imprisoned for months after her mother was hanged. She was left mentally shattered. And still, the trials continued. Giles Corey, the obstinate farmer who had refused to enter a plea to protect his property from seizure, faced a medieval punishment, peine forte et dure. He was pressed to death with heavy stones laid on his chest, his body slowly crushed over 2 agonizing days. He never cried out in pain. His final words, legend says, were, "More weight." By September, the hangings had taken 19 lives. Others languished in prison, awaiting execution. The colony was on the brink. Crops rotted in fields. Businesses collapsed. Families were torn apart. The air in Salem hung heavy, not with witchcraft, but with grief, guilt, and dread. What had begun as a search for purity had become a festival of death. And still, the court did not waver. Each new corpse, each broken family, was seen as another soul saved from Satan's grip. But something had begun to shift beneath the surface. A quiet resistance. A growing sense that this righteous cause had gone terribly wrong. The first cracks in the hysteria were beginning to form, and soon they would shatter everything.
The autumn wind carried more than falling leaves through the streets of Salem. It carried unease. The executions had begun to disturb even the most faithful. Ministers who had once praised the trials were now whispering doubts. Families who had buried their loved ones were no longer quiet in their grief. The fear that had once unified the village was beginning to divide it. In the shadows of this crumbling panic, a bold voice emerged. Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most respected religious leaders in New England. Though his son Cotton had defended the trials, Increase took a different stance. He penned a treatise titled Cases of Conscience, concerning evil spirits personating men. In it, he made a stunning claim that it was better for 10 witches to go free than for one innocent person to be condemned. His words carried weight. They echoed through churches and courtrooms, forcing the colony's leaders to pause. Spectral evidence, the foundation of most of the convictions, came under intense scrutiny. Could the testimony of afflicted girls, claiming visions and invisible attacks, truly justify a death sentence? Governor Phipps, who had returned from the northern frontier, now faced a colony in chaos. His own wife had been named as a potential witch. With public opinion shifting and the colony's credibility unraveling, he made a fateful decision. On October 29, 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. Trials continued, but now under stricter standards. Without spectral evidence, most accusations crumbled. Juries acquitted the accused or refused to indict. The spell of hysteria was breaking, but not without consequences. In prison, many remained in chains, unable to pay their fees or afford bail. Some had died already, nameless and unnoticed. In January 1693, Governor Phipps began pardoning the remaining prisoners. Among them was Elizabeth Proctor, who gave birth in her cell before finally walking free. But her husband, John, had already been hanged. Their family, like so many, was forever marked by the trials. And what of the accusers? Abigail Williams, one of the first girls to cry witchcraft, vanished from history. No record of her remains beyond the trials. Ann Putnam Jr., just 12 years old at the time, would later stand in front of her congregation and offer a rare confession. She admitted that her accusations had been false, that she had been misled by a great delusion of Satan. But by then, the damage was done. Reverend Samuel Parris faced public outrage. The congregation that had once supported him now turned cold. By 1697, he was forced to resign. He faded from power, carrying with him the guilt of a village he had helped unravel. In total, 20 people were executed, 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death. At least 5 more died in prison. Over 150 were accused. Dozens of lives ruined, a community broken. And yet, no witches were ever found. No dark covens uncovered. Just fear, pressure, lies, and the crushing weight of belief. But Salem's story wasn't buried with the victims. It would be remembered, studied, debated, and retold as a haunting lesson. In the quiet that followed the hysteria, a new question emerged. How could it have happened? And perhaps more chilling, could it happen again? The village tried to forget, but history never did.
The years following the trials were filled with silence, heavy, shameful, and unresolved. Salem, once aflame with accusation and frenzy, now sat cold and fractured. Families who had lost loved ones bore their grief in isolation. Those who had made accusations rarely spoke of it, and the town itself, forever marked, sank into a kind of haunted quiet. But beneath that silence, a reckoning slowly began to unfold. In 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and soul-searching. It was called a day of official humiliation, meant to reflect on the late tragedy that had unfolded just 5 years before. Ministers across the colony led their congregations in prayers for forgiveness. But for the families of the dead, prayers weren't enough. Public opinion had turned sharply against those who had led the trials. Reverend Samuel Parris tried to cling to his pulpit, but the village had grown bitter. Parishioners confronted him. A petition circulated calling for his removal. He apologized, grudgingly, admitting some fault, but still defending his intentions. It wasn't enough. By 1697, he was gone from Salem, his reputation shattered beyond repair. Meanwhile, survivors of the accused, those whose names had been blackened and families torn apart, began fighting for justice. It was not just about reputation, it was about survival. Many had lost property. Prison fees had bankrupted them. Children were orphaned. Homes, land, dignity, all had been stripped away by accusation. One of the loudest voices for justice came from Samuel Sewall, one of the 9 judges who had presided over the trials. In 1697, during that day of fasting, he stood in the South Church of Boston, head bowed in shame, and read a public confession. He took full responsibility for his role in the court. In a powerful act of contrition, he prayed that God would not visit the sin of his judgments upon him or his children. His statement was radical. He was the only judge to publicly apologize. Others remained silent. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice, never expressed regret. He died years later, never acknowledging the horror his court had unleashed. But something had shifted. Salem's name had become infamous. It was no longer simply a village. It was a symbol, a warning. In the decades that followed, petitions for reparations continued. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill that reversed the convictions of many of the accused and granted modest financial compensation to their families. It was a political gesture, perhaps a sincere one, but it could never restore what had been lost. Some families were left out entirely. Others refused the money out of pride, anger, or heartbreak. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most prominent accusers, had grown into adulthood, carrying a burden too great for silence. In 1706, at the age of 26, she stood before her church in Salem Village and confessed publicly. She read a statement asking forgiveness for her role in the deaths of the innocent, saying she had been deluded by Satan. The room was still as she spoke. Her words, while powerful, came too late for those she had condemned. Time moved forward. Salem evolved. But the echoes of 1692 never fully faded. They lingered in the soil, in whispered stories passed down through generations. In the woods beyond Gallows Hill, in the walls of old homes where fear once ruled, and in a young American nation beginning to question the dangers of unchecked power, blind faith, and mass hysteria. Salem was not just a tragedy. It was a warning carved into the conscience of a country that hadn't yet been born. The reckoning had begun. But the soul of Salem would never be truly at peace. Not yet.
By the 18th century, the events of 1692 had begun to slip into the realm of memory, but they were not forgotten. Salem had changed, but it could not outrun its past. As the colonies crept toward revolution and civil rule, the story of the witch trials remained an unhealed scar, buried deep beneath sermons and silence. But slowly, that silence gave way to a search for meaning. The descendants of the accused lived in the shadow of shame, many quietly erasing the connection from family histories. Yet others fought to preserve it not as disgrace, but as caution. Names like Proctor, Nurse, and Corey became more than just historical footnotes. They became symbols of resistance against injustice. Gallows Hill, where the executions had taken place, remained untouched for generations. There was no monument, no gravestone, no official acknowledgement. It was as though the town had hoped that by not speaking of it, the past would stay buried. But trauma doesn't stay quiet forever. In 1752, Salem Village was renamed Danvers, a deliberate step toward dissociating the town from its infamous legacy. Salem Town, where the trials were formally conducted, remained, but the division in names reflected a deeper split. The community had grown, but so had the desire to separate from the sins of their ancestors. Still, storytellers began to circle back. In the 1800s, as the young United States wrestled with identity, writers and historians found the Salem Witch Trials to be fertile ground. The tale of fear and persecution, of neighbor turning against neighbor, struck a nerve. It felt deeply American both in its horror and its warning. Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of the country's earliest literary giants, and a descendant of Judge John Hathorne, famously added a W to his name, becoming Hawthorne to distance himself from his ancestors' legacy. But he didn't turn away from the past. In works like The House of the Seven Gables and The Scarlet Letter, he explored themes of guilt, judgment, and inherited cynicos of Salem's ghosts woven into American literature. By the 19th century, historians and antiquarians began studying the trials in earnest. Books were written, diaries were uncovered, old court documents, once hidden away, were examined with new eyes. The narrative began to shift from theological explanation to human tragedy. The image of the accused women once feared, as agents of the devil, transformed. They became martyrs of injustice. Innocence destroyed by religious extremism, misogyny, greed, and mass hysteria. Their voices, silenced in the 1690s, were beginning to be heard again through the written word. And yet, the full truth was elusive. Many documents had been lost or destroyed. The testimony of the afflicted was riddled with contradictions. Motives were tangled: religious, economic, political. Historians debated what really sparked the frenzy. Was it the influence of ergot poisoning, triggering hallucinations? Was it political power plays, repressed trauma, or simply the combustible power of fear in a rigid society? What was clear was this: the story of Salem was not just about witches. It was about how societies collapse under fear, about the ease with which justice can be perverted, and about the terrible cost of certainty. By the end of the 1800s, Salem had become more than a town. It was a mirror, a symbol of how a community, under pressure, could destroy its own in the name of righteousness. But the reckoning was still not complete. The dead had never been properly honored. Their names were remembered in books, but not in stone. Their voices echoed in literature, but not in law. It would take another century before America would truly begin to face them.
By the early 20th century, Salem had become something else entirely: a paradox. On the surface, it was a modern American town. Streets bustled with cars. Tourists strolled through its shops and cafes. But just beneath the cobblestones and storefronts, the ground still trembled with unspoken history. And as America entered a new century, the town's darkest chapter was about to be commercialized, sensationalized, and finally, remembered. The trials, once a source of shame, began to take on a strange dual life. On one side, scholars and educators continued their work, uncovering archives, restoring family lineages, and retelling the story with compassion and clarity. On the other side, Salem was becoming something else: a destination. By the 1950s, with the rise of mass media and popular culture, Salem's past became fodder for films, plays, and Halloween tourism. Arthur Miller's The Crucible, written in 1953 during the height of McCarthyism, used the witch trials as a haunting allegory. In it, the hysteria of Salem was paralleled with the anti-communist purges of the era, a reminder that fear and accusation remained powerful tools of political control. Miller's play reawakened public interest in the trials, introducing new generations to the horror of 1692 through the lens of moral courage and resistance. But as Salem's past resurfaced, it was increasingly framed in terms of spectacle. Gift shops sold witch hats and brooms. Psychic readers set up booths in town squares. Ghost tours promised glimpses of the condemned. And every October, the town transformed into a carnival of the macabre. For some, it was a celebration of remembrance. For others, it felt like mockery, commercialization on the graves of the innocent. Yet beneath the costumes and candles, a deeper movement took shape, one that sought justice not in theater or tourism, but in truth. Historians and descendants of the victims began pushing for official recognition. For decades, the records had been fragmented, incomplete. Many victims still hadn't been formally exonerated by law. Their convictions technically stood. Their names remained blackened. In 1992, on the 300th anniversary of the trials, a powerful step was taken. A memorial was unveiled in Salem, a quiet, solemn place of reflection, built near the site of the executions. 20 stone benches, each inscribed with the name and date of death of a victim, were placed along a low stone wall. No statues, no grandeur, just silence, space, names. It was the first permanent tribute to those who had suffered under the hysteria. That same year, President George H.W. Bush issued a formal acknowledgement, calling the trials a tragedy and honoring the memory of the innocent. It was a symbolic gesture, but a necessary one. Still, even after 300 years, not all the names had been cleared. One name, in particular, stood out: Elizabeth Johnson, Jr., Convicted in 1693 but never executed, had never been officially exonerated. For centuries, her name remained on the record. It wasn't until 2022, over 329 years later, that her conviction was finally overturned, thanks to the efforts of middle school students and their teacher from North Andover, Massachusetts. Their research, determination, and moral clarity succeeded where generations of officials had failed. It was a remarkable act, not just of justice, but of remembrance, a reminder that the past is not static, that healing, however delayed, is still possible. Today, Salem stands at the crossroads of history and myth. Its streets are filled with tourists, scholars, artists, and descendants. Its identity is tangled, part cautionary tale, part cultural phenomenon. But at its core, the truth remains. The Salem Witch Trials were not about magic. They were about power, fear, belief turned against itself. And in the end, they were about ordinary people, destroyed by extraordinary delusion. The reckoning continues, but so does the remembering.
As the 21st century unfolded, Salem's dual identity deepened. On one hand, it was a bustling hub of commerce and tourism filled with witch-themed shops, haunted walking tours, and October festivals that drew hundreds of thousands. On the other, it remained a sacred ground of tragedy, reflection, and hard-won truth. But one question continued to echo beneath the surface of every conversation, every reenactment, every guided tour. Why did it happen? Historians have spent decades unraveling that question, peeling back layers of religion, psychology, politics, and fear to understand how an entire community could implode so completely. One leading theory centers on Salem's social structure. In 1692, the village was deeply divided, not just ideologically, but geographically. Salem Village and Salem Town were economically and politically at odds. Salem Town, with its busy port and wealth, leaned toward commerce. The village, isolated and poorer, clung to Puritan tradition. That tension created fertile ground for resentment and suspicion. Add to this a rigid patriarchal society, where women were expected to be silent, obedient, and pious. The vast majority of those accused were women who defied those expectations, outspoken, widowed, independent, or simply poor. Witchcraft accusations became a tool for policing behavior, silencing dissent, and settling old scores. Others point to psychological explanations. The girls who accused others, the so-called afflicted, were young, impressionable, and trapped in a world where they had little agency. Some historians argue that their symptoms were a kind of unconscious rebellion. There fits a language of protest in a society that didn't listen to children, especially girls. Others believe mass psychogenic illness, what might now be called mass hysteria, played a role, as fear spread like infection. Then there was religion. The Puritan worldview was steeped in predestination, divine punishment, and the constant presence of Satan. In their minds, the devil wasn't symbolic, he was real, active, and always hunting souls. Every misfortune, illness, crop failure, stillbirth could be interpreted as a sign of spiritual rot. The Salem trials didn't happen despite religion. They happened because of it when faith was weaponized as law. Political instability added fuel. The colony's charter had recently been revoked by England, and the new one had just been issued. Authority was in flux. Leaders were uncertain. In times of transition, people look for enemies. They seek control. In Salem, that need for order found expression in the courtroom and in the gallows. And yet, there were deeper, more uncomfortable truths. Some accusations were driven by envy, by greed, by personal vendettas. Neighbors accused neighbors to gain property, settle feuds, or deflect suspicion. The court rewarded confession with survival. It rewarded accusation with attention. It punished silence with death. In many ways, the Salem Witch Trials were a perfect storm religion. Fear, power, gender, and politics colliding in a tinderbox of uncertainty. And once the fire started, it burned with terrifying speed. But perhaps the most haunting element of Salem is not what caused it, but how long it took to stop. For months, despite mounting evidence of injustice, the community continued to hang its own. Why? Because the system they trusted told them it was right. The real danger of Salem was not the devil. It was the moment when doubt became dangerous, when questioning authority was treated as guilt, when silence was suspicion, when the truth, fragile, complicated, human, was no match for belief. Salem wasn't an isolated event. Its mechanisms have echoed through history in witch hunts of different kinds, in show trials, in propaganda, in moral panics. The clothes change. The language shifts. But the core remains. When fear rules, justice dies. And that is why the Salem Witch Trials remain a mirror held up to the present. Not a story of witches but of people, of how easily we can turn on each other, and how long it takes to heal.
In the quiet corners of Salem today, if you listen carefully, the echoes still remain, not in superstition or ghosts, but in the weight of names, the cost of silence, and the ache of remembering. The witch trials were more than a tragedy. They became a crucible that forged a deeper understanding of justice in the American conscience. But that understanding came slowly, through generations of reckoning. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, new voices began reclaiming the narrative. Educators introduced the trials into classrooms not as myth or folklore, but as a case study in mass hysteria, injustice, and civil liberties. Lawyers studied Salem as a cautionary tale of judicial overreach. Psychologists explored it as a textbook example of the dangers of groupthink. Activists pointed to Salem in moments of political panic, reminding the public that the mechanics of fear are timeless. Salem's history became not just about what happened, but about how a society remembers, and who gets to tell the story. For centuries, the victims had no voices in public spaces. That began to change. Descendants of the condemned organized remembrance ceremonies. Local officials worked with historians to preserve trial documents and protect historical sites. Artists and writers reframed the narrative around the humanity of the accused, portraying them not as vague shadows of the past, but as real people. Mothers, fathers, children, flawed and frightened, but undeserving of death. In 2017, the Proctor's Ledge Memorial was unveiled, the first time the actual execution site was publicly marked. After years of forensic research, historians confirmed that this humble slope, hidden behind a Walgreens, was where the hangings had taken place. No longer just legend, it was now recognized, preserved, and mourned. The memorial is stark, powerful, and quiet. 20 granite stones, each carved with a name and date of death. There are no statues, no drama, just facts. The truth, finally in stone. It marked a turning point, not just in remembrance, but in responsibility. It challenged the community and the nation to confront what justice looks like after centuries of delay. It asked, what do we owe the dead when the wrongs done to them cannot be undone? Tourism in Salem still thrives. Each October, the town floods with visitors, some seeking history, others seeking spectacle. But for every witch-themed trinket, there's now a growing number of plaques, exhibits, and walking tours that focus on the real people, the real courtrooms, the real terror that unfolded over that year. A new generation of Salem residents, educators, and descendants continues to push for dignity, accuracy, and context, not to erase the popular culture version of Salem, but to complicate it, to remind the world that what happened in 1692 wasn't fantasy, it wasn't magic, it was systemic failure, and that failure should never be made light of. Salem is now a living memory, layered with contradiction, a town that profits from its darkest hour, yet works to honor it. a place of myth, but also truth. And in that tension lies its power, because the trials are not simply behind us. They are beside us, waiting, watching, always possible. When truth is ignored, when fear is politicized, when justice bends to the will of panic. The real legacy of Salem is not buried in graves. It walks among us, in every courtroom, every classroom, every moment we choose courage over fear, and the names carved in stone will remain, not to curse, but to caution, not to haunt, but to remind.
The final chapter of Salem's story is not one of endings, but of echoes, reverberations that stretch far beyond 1692, far beyond Massachusetts. The Salem Witch Trials have embedded themselves into the American psyche, not as an isolated tragedy, but as a perpetual warning of how fragile truth and justice can be when fear becomes law. Today, Salem exists in layers. Beneath the modern storefronts and candlelit tours lies a town that has become a symbol of what happens when society lets go of reason. Each October, the city transforms into a magnet for the curious and the costumed, a whirlwind of ghosts and witches and thrill-seekers. It is festive, loud, theatrical, but amid the noise, a quieter truth endures. There are school children who still visit Proctor's Ledge and fall silent. College students who study the court records and ask difficult questions. Families who trace their ancestry to the victims, bringing flowers to memorial stones. Teachers who use the trials not just to teach history, but ethics, psychology, and the value of dissent. In many ways, Salem has become a paradox, a place that exploits its past, even as it seeks to reckon with it. The same streets that lead tourists to souvenir shops also guide them to places of remembrance. The same story that fuels Halloween parties also teaches the terrifying cost of injustice. But perhaps that duality is fitting, because the Salem witch trials were never simple. They were not just about religious extremism, or gender, or greed. They were about what happens when all of those forces collide, when the need for control overrides compassion, when belief replaces evidence, when silence is mistaken for guilt and confession becomes currency for survival. We look back now and wonder, how could they not see? How could judges, ministers, neighbors, even children participate in something so monstrous? But the truth is, we've seen it happen since. Salem was not the last witch hunt, just the most infamous. Its DNA lives on in every political purge, every smear campaign, every courtroom where fear outweighs fact, in every moment when the powerful silence the vulnerable, in every system that demands conformity over conscience. And so, the story of Salem endures not as legend, but as lesson. It is a call to vigilance, a call to question, a call to remember that justice is not infallible, and neither are we. In the end, the tragedy of Salem is not just that innocent people died, it's that their deaths were preventable, that they were victims of a society that believed itself righteous, that they were silenced not by witchcraft, but by certainty. Today, the names of those 20 executed in 1692 are carved in stone, remembered in books, recited in classrooms. But the greatest memorial is the caution they left behind, that justice must be slow, that truth must be tested, and that fear, if left unchecked, will always come for the innocent. Salem will never be forgotten, because its story is still being told, because it is still possible, and because we are still responsible.